Scott. Welcome to episode 23.
Great to be with you, Mark. It's hard to believe we've hit 23 already.
I know, and there are still people who want to keep talking to us. You know?
Well, we're thankful for that, and we have a good group today.
We do, and a special shout out to Access Forum, which I know is an organization you're very close to.
Yeah, it's a terrific professional society, if you will, for access professionals. And as you know, we've developed a relationship with them, a partnering relationship with them, where they're promoting the use of our videos, our episodes, our podcasts with their members, but then also today, turning around and helping us plan an episode and provide speakers for it.
Well, yeah, and it's again, I know each time I talk about important topics, you and I are not. We're tackling some big things, and today we're in the middle of an election season. We're in the middle of a lot of dialogue around drug pricing, and today we get to look at the global perspective. So sort of not just look at the U.S., but look at what's going on worldwide. And I know we have some great guests. Scott, you want to introduce them?
Yes. So I think of this as our episode on comparative market access, if you will. So anyway, we've got with us today Nikos Maniadakis, Kim Baldwin, and Fazia Hussein. Welcome, and thank you all for joining us. And maybe if each of you could just briefly introduce yourself. We'll start with you, Nikos.
First of all, thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure discussing with you today. I'm a professor of health policy and management at the National School of Public Health in Athens. I spent actually 25 years of my life in the market access field. I started many years ago in England when the UK was introducing the National Institute of Clinical Excellence. We were at the time, in the ISPOC Congress, we were 50 people. These days it's 5,000, 7,000. It's interesting to see the field, flourishing. Obviously, this reflects how important the pricing and reimbursement of pharmaceuticals is. So over the last 25 years, I spent time in academia, time in the industry, and also time in consulting. So I've seen the field evolving from different perspectives. So with that experience, it's really nice to be with you today.
Yeah. Thank you, Nikos, and welcome. How about you, Kim?
Nice to see you all. Nice to meet you all. My name is Kimberly Baldwin. I am the Senior Vice President of Ipsen Biopharmaceuticals. I've been at Ipsen for the last 10 years, and I've been in market access for over 20 years. My team is responsible from everything to do, right from the start of the patient creating the drug, making the drug, as far as trade and distribution. We have reimbursement. We also have payer and the contracting and pricing team. Patient services is here, as well as our corporate account team, which calls on the academic institutions, and then a GPO, and as well as veteran affairs.
Terrific. That's a great breadth of activities. We'll look forward to learning more from you. And Fazia?
Hi, everybody. Fazia Hussein. I am currently the Vice President of Public Policy for McKesson, where I'm responsible for managing our diverse interests across our 360-degree healthcare portfolio. So if there's a healthcare issue, our team helps manage it, but we always go with the mission of the company, which is to improve healthcare outcomes for all. Prior to coming to McKesson, I was the head of market access and reimbursement at Avalier, but more importantly, I've spent 25 years doing healthcare policy, always focused on patients and advocacy on behalf of their caregivers and their families. So excited to be here and talk about this important issue.
Good. Well, welcome, Fazia. So Mark, Access Forum has provided us 3 terrific experts we're looking forward to today. A special thank you to Joe Boswell, the president of the organization, and Komi Akboso, who has helped us put this together.
Great. Yeah, no, they've been great and exciting partners. And we're also looking forward to being a part of Access Forum going forward and into their event in 2025.
Yeah.
But let's jump into understanding sort of the global versus U.S. drug pricing and market access. And if we could, why don't we start with you, Nikos, and sort of share, how drug coverage decisions are generally made in the developed world outside of the U.S. And can you sort of give us a brief introduction to that?
Yeah, of course. First of all, when we say developed world outside the U.S., I would primarily refer to Europe. Some of the European countries, especially the big five, Germany, the UK, Spain, Italy, France are amongst the top globally pharmaceutical markets. And then outside Europe, you have in Asia, Japan, which has many similarities to some of the European countries. And then obviously China, India, and Brazil are big countries, but are outside the club of developed economies. So I will refer primarily to the European landscape and Japan. And just to amuse the discussion, I will use three words to introduce the landscape, and the words are regulation. There's a lot of regulation in the European markets. Diversity. There are lots of different approaches to the pricing and reimbursement. And there is complexity. And there is complexity in Europe because we are making decisions at the European level, at national level, but also now we try to coordinate our efforts in Europe and make some common decisions. So that's why I try to make reference to complexity. So when it comes to market access, there are, let's say, four steps. One is the regulatory approval of the products, pricing, reimbursement. And then recently, in the last 10, 15 years, quite a few countries are trying to control the access, the use, and the cost of pharmaceuticals with managed entry agreements and special types of agreements with the manufacturers, which are representing today in the discussion. So when it comes to pricing, after something gets approval in Europe, one of the differences between the US and Europe is that we have a European Medicines Agency, like you have the FDA, but we still have to this day local agencies in the countries. And some of the products, not necessarily all, some of the products can be approved at the national level in a few countries and one country recognizing the other. But after you get European approval, then you have regulations, and you have to face really tough negotiations for pricing and reimbursement in the European countries and in Japan. I would try to be short. I would try to classify the systems in three, let's say, categories. First of all, there are some systems in Europe which basically they don't have the infrastructure to run a complex health technology assessment evaluations. So some of these less advanced healthcare systems in Europe, they rely on, let's say, mathematical, very mechanistic ways of defining price and reimbursement. Primarily, they rely on external price referencing and internal price referencing. So they relied on setting their prices on the price of pharmaceuticals in other markets close to them, and they have mathematical ways of defining the price in their country. Or they rely internally in the prices of the products already in the country. So there are a few systems actually in Europe which rely on internal or external price referencing, but most of the European countries these days, they rely on health technology assessment. There is some effort to evaluate the benefits of the new pharmaceutical products for the healthcare system. And this evaluation, this health technology assessment, sometimes informs a pricing decision, sometimes informs a reimbursement decision. There is a cluster of countries in Europe where they rely primarily on health technology assessment for pricing, others on reimbursement. Now, there is a wide difference amongst Europeans on how they define value. That's not only an issue for us in Europe, it's a global issue. Value, innovation, benefit means different things to different people. But for the sake of this discussion, I would say that there are some countries that rely mostly on the clinical benefit. For instance, countries like Germany, for instance, like France, they will evaluate the clinical benefit of the new product. So as the clinical benefit is being proven in the clinical trials that the company we share with the authorities. There are some other types of systems that they define benefit in terms of cost effectiveness, like for instance the UK. Okay, so basically they will some of the Nordic countries like Sweden, for instance, they will define the value in terms of how cost effective the product is. Now, to justify what I said about complexity and diversion is that every single country has a different type of organization, different types of methods to build the dossier. Different types of criteria for making decisions. Some of them are not very transparent. Companies try to elicit what are the criteria by making inferences based on their decisions. Some of the criteria are different depending on the disease, depending on the group of patients we refer, on the type of products. For instance, recently there has been a lot of discussion around gene therapy, about advanced therapeutics, about orphan medications, about oncology products, about products for kids, products for the people at terminal stages of their life. So this really creates, for the two ladies in the discussion today, it creates a very complex environment in which they really have to navigate very carefully. They have to prepare many years upfront, to have all the evidence needed for those tough negotiations. And to add to that complexity, my final point will focus on managerial agreements. Many of the countries will sign with manufacturers agreements, which basically, in the context of these agreements, the governments, and obviously I talked about regulation because in Europe we have public organizations funding healthcare. It's either taxpayers through National Health Service or sickness funds like those we have in Germany and France. So that's why there is a lot of negotiation on behalf of the public. So these payers will sign with the manufacturers agreements to split the risk and basically either transfer some of the financial risks or some of the risks that have to do with the effectiveness of the product in real life. So overall, and that's my final point, not only we have negotiations at the national level, but in certain European countries, the same negotiations you have at the national level, you will have it at regional level. Examples of these countries, for instance, is Spain and Italy. You have to negotiate at the regional level, and to add to this complexity, in Europe now, we try to coordinate our efforts at the European level. There is a program which is being working, the European Commission has been working on for the last 10 years, is UNETA. It's an effort to coordinate our clinical assessment. This now program will be more effective in the next year. And basically, many of the countries will start, dealing all of them together in doing the clinical evaluation of the benefits for certain categories of products. So overall, it's an environment quite different to the US. Japan now is starting using HTA for some of the innovative products. And with that light, I will give the floor to the ladies to discuss the differences between the Europe and the US.
So before we do that, Nikos, so the countries either use an HTA kind of assessment and their thoughts about value to derive what they think an appropriate net price should be, and I assume discuss that then with the manufacturer in the kinds of negotiations that you mentioned, or they use referencing if they don't have the infrastructure to do that themselves. And so that's fine. But what if the manufacturer doesn't agree the perspective or doesn't agree on the price and says, I don't think that's right?
Well, that's usually the case.
Yeah.
The manufacturer spends billions of dollars to bring a new entity into the market, so they want to be rewarded. One of the complexities about Europe is that you cannot really apply differential pricing. There are huge differences in terms of the affordability of the different countries. Mm-hmm. And if there was, let's say, there were wars and differences and closed healthcare systems, the manufacturers could do really differential pricing. And Greece is a less affluent country in comparison to Germany. But in the context of the European Union, where everything is shared and there is transparency and there is move of the products, they have to find the right price that will make everybody happy, and that's what really is. And so the manufacturers usually do not agree, but this is an evidence-based business. So the manufacturers have to collect the data earlier on in the process to prove to the decision makers the value of their product. It's a question of providing the right evidence that they will deliver value for money. And the other thing is, in the last 10 years, with the new technology, the real world evidence we have in the healthcare systems, a lot of the evidence now we collect to prove the value is post pricing and reimbursement. So there needs to be some goodwill, some trust in between the governments and the manufacturers, and work like partners for the benefit of patients, and basically find innovative solutions to help the people. I want to say one thing. In the past, 20, 25 years ago, we were often very innovative in the way we were discovering pharmaceuticals. The industry has discovered some fantastic products. They help the people, but they launch these products in a non-sophisticated, non-intelligent way. These days, the way we do business, the way we use the products into the market, the way we price and reimburse and use the products must be innovative as well. We must use our brains to try to work together to find ways of giving the right product to the right patient at the right time, at the right price. That needs a partnership, that needs more sophistication. It needs trust, and it needs tools. It needs data, and it needs to be a dynamic process.
Yeah, it certainly sounds like the evidence generation to inform the HTA and other discussions is going to be super critical there. But then it sounds like there's a relatively narrow band of pricing amongst all the nations in Europe. But if you just absolutely don't agree, I guess your only choice is to walk away and not have coverage for the product at all in that country. Is that right?
That's an option, but it doesn't really happen in reality. I mean, the manufacturers have a mission to serve the people and the patients.
Yeah. The price is going to be above the production costs, and the patients are in need. And so
this is the cause. This is the cause of delays. There are lots of delays in the access. That also has an opportunity cost for patients. Yeah. Sometimes negotiations with some of the countries might take 2 or 3 years in order for them to find an acceptable solution. And that there's a price there, an indirect price for the patients, that they don't have access to the products, even though in Europe these days there are more early access programs than there were before. Yeah. But to my knowledge, there are very, 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 very few cases where the manufacturers didn't really agree with governments at the end of the day, because everybody really, despite the differences, they are there to serve the good of their patients.
Well, I think that gets us to, let's turn to Kimberly, because I think everybody's got aligned on the same goals. You said it well, Professor. You said, the right drug to the right patient at the right time at the right price, right? Like, I think we'd like to get to that point as well. So, Kim, do you mind sharing with your perspective on how the U.S. is making some of these decisions and the approach that we're having in this country around access and pricing?
Sure, absolutely. So it's a little bit different in the U.S. And I'm really appreciative of Nikos kind of going through a little bit of what happens at launch, right? So at launch, it's varying because we have multiple payers in this system, right? So we have the payers have different coverage approaches. There's government programs like state Medicaid, for example, and the Veterans Administration. They will cover the drugs at launch, right? So the price is the WAC that you assess, or the wholesale acquisition cost. And for our commercial payers, which we have many of throughout the United States, commercial payers for both commercially insured patients as well as Medicare Part D patients, often what they will do as soon as we launch the drug, they will put what we refer to as a new to market block on that drug for up to 6 months. And during that new to market block, that gives the payer time to do what we refer to as the clinical review, and they assess the entire market basket. And the market basket is what's in the market today. So if it's a new product, they'll look at the whole class and evaluate the clinical efficacy, and then ultimately the financial impact to their budget. So many factors are included during that review process. So in addition to the clinical review, the payers will look at the disease state, the drug class, how many drugs are already out on the market. Is this first to market? Is it the first to market, or are there multiple drugs? Is there a generic in the marketplace? They'll look at whether it's an ultra rare or an ultra rare drug. They'll look at it. Is it a generic? Is it in the oncology? Is it a protected class? So many different factors are factored into this. So people look and say, gosh, I have to wait 6 months to be able to access this drug. And the payers will say, yes. But there are workarounds, right? So if it's the first to market drug and it's the first drug in the marketplace, the payers are not going to restrict that. They want to make sure that those patients do have access. So during this time frame, I have to be careful about that. So they have to make sure that they do have access. But if there's multiple drugs already in the market, that drug is blocked, right? So it's important to recognize that. But a medical exception can be submitted on behalf of the patient. And oftentimes the drug will be approved depending on all the factors that I just mentioned. But there's multiple competing factors here. So each individual drug is looked at differently during that launch period. Fazia, I don't know if you have any additional insights to add to that.
Yeah, I think that, if we think about, the federal programs and we just focus in on Medicare because of its size and contribution to healthcare spending, I think that the Part D benefit, which reflects the retail pharmacy or self-administered drug benefit, very much mirrors sort of the dynamics that you're talking about in the commercial marketplace. Where CMS works with contractors who utilize the pharmaceutical and therapeutics committees to evaluate treatments based on their cost effectiveness and the various considerations that you outline, and then make formulary decisions which impact patient access and their out-of-pocket costs. And of course, the Part D plans do have to meet formulary standards that Medicare has established in order to protect Medicare beneficiary access and interest. On the Part B side, or the medical benefit side, it's a bit different. Historically, Medicare has not used price as an explicit criteria when making its coverage decisions. We've always said that, the drug is covered under Medicare Part B until it isn't. As long as it's meeting the core criteria for medical benefit coverage, which means that the drug has to be considered reasonable and medically necessary, which means it's safe, it's effective, it's not experimental, and it's appropriate for Medicare patients, and it fits within an established Medicare benefit category. So as we're thinking about data and evidence and use of HTA, I think that's an interesting intersection with how Medicare makes its coverage decisions, because cost is not an explicit factor, but we know implicitly it may rise to the top of factors that bring certain products or certain product classes to higher interest for CMS to examine the clinical data that's feeding into a determination of what is medically necessary. And things that we might find get modified coverage or limited coverage while requiring the generation of real world evidence may face that issue because there's not enough data in the clinical trials for patients who are 65 or over or that are covered within the benefit to make that reasonable determination. So I do think that within the Medicare program, there are some interesting dynamics, and use of data, as Nikos was calling out, is kind of similar but a little bit different. Because while we can use clinical and cost effectiveness data, Medicare is not using economic calculations like QALYs. So any type of a determination that makes an incremental value to life. And I think that is a philosophical difference here in the US relative to other countries, is that we really pride ourselves on, it's like the right drug for the right patient, right at the right price. But here it's like, we want the right drug first. We want it for all potential patients, and we don't want to have to look at the price. And I think that environment is shifting a bit, and we can see some of those trends in the federal programs. I'm happy to highlight 3 that might kickstart some more active conversation. But I think like other, US payers, Medicare in particular, is continuing the slow march to value-based care, right? Which we all, I think, appreciate is taking way longer than expected. And the impact on individual drug prices is tenuous at best. But we do see some new ideas from CMS in this arena in terms of value-based care. And I think the most recent announcement for the cell and gene therapy, or the CGT access model, is a perfect example of it. It's designed to improve access for treatments that could potentially be life-saving, transformative for Medicaid patients, starting with sickle cell disease. But it is very unique in that the model will support outcomes-based agreements between the states and manufacturers. So really actively shifting and putting the government in the mix as an arbiter of these outcomes-based agreements, so paying based on value and outcomes. We also see Medicare trying to address misaligned formulary incentives in how they are changing and updating the new Medicare Part D benefit, which is going into effect in January, by capping patient out-of-pocket costs at $2,000 and then shifting the risk back to plans and manufacturers, particularly in that catastrophic phase. So trying to realign those incentives in order to improve patient access, to reduce out-of-pocket costs, and ultimately, improve adherence. The third trend that I'd probably call out on the government side, of course, is the one that's been making the headlines the most, and that is, direct Medicare drug negotiation. This, of course, is very transformative for the Medicare program. It is the first time that the government is negotiating on behalf of seniors, and it has a lot of potential. $6 billion in savings estimated by the agency, $1.5 billion in potential reduction of patient out-of-pocket costs, but generally is still getting mixed reviews. It is new for Medicare, but I think also just new for the U.S. healthcare system to move to this direct negotiation type of model. And we're trying to figure out, what does this mean for access? What does this mean for innovation? What are we compromising along the way, for access and affordability? And how do we make sure it's realized for patients?
Mm-hmm. So, Kim and Fozzie, if I could follow up with a similar to what I asked Nikos, if the manufacturer and the payer in the U.S., whichever, whether it's a commercial payer or one of the Medicare, Medicaid, or other government programs, if they're not agreeing on, what the rebate should be or what the net price should be, however you want to think about that, then what happens? Kim, what happens in the commercial world, Part D, kind of world?
It depends. It becomes an active negotiation, right? So typically what will happen is during that review process, the clinical team will review, price will be taken out of consideration, right? So they'll start off with the review process, and then they'll come back to the committee and say, okay, this drug is a must add, a do not add, or a nice to add. And there's different vernacular for how each payer will use that. If it's a must add, then that takes the renegotiation. It changes the negotiation, right? Because then it really does not matter. And that usually you'll see that in an ultra rare space or protected class. It does not matter what happens there. If it's a nice to add or do not add, it does not matter, because then it becomes an active negotiation for price, right? Yeah. So, and what type of rebate that drug will, or the payer will be able to get. And then you're negotiating for status. So Fozzie talked a little bit about this in the formulary status. Do you want to be a preferred agent? Do you want to be sole preferred? Do you want to be one of one, one of two? You could be in a non-preferred specialty drug class. So it becomes an active negotiation. And typically what a payer will do is say, you must have this rebate to even have your foot in the door to have a conversation. And depending on where you want to be placed on that formulary really opens the door to any conversation that you would have. And it also really depends on how many drugs are in the class. Are you first to market, or do you have a competitor in the space? Do you want to be co-preferred, or do you want to be non-preferred? Once you get into that non-preferred, it becomes very, very difficult, and the payers can make it almost impossible to make sure that you do not get access to the drug. So that's part of the negotiation process too.
And Kim, Nikos referenced the importance of HTA methodologies in Europe. How much do those influence the discussions here versus I just want a bigger rebate versus, what your competitor's net price or rebate is? What matters here in that dynamic?
Great question. So I'll let Fozzie talk about the government space, because that's a little bit different, right? Okay. So that HTA-like environment is really the individual. So you have your guidelines that are out there, right? So you could have NCCN guidelines, for example, that helps determine where that product placement is. But then you have the own P&T committee that's at the payer. So they're the ones that are actually mandating, do we want this? Do we need this? Do we have to have this for patient care? And then on the government side, it's a little bit different. So it depends on whether it's a commercial product or a Medicare, Medicaid, and so forth. So that changes the game on how you negotiate that.
Okay.
And maybe what I would say is that negotiation in the Medicare space, particularly for the new Medicare negotiation program, is very different than the commercial
Yes.
market. It's very structured. You have what I would say is a strict timeline in terms of activities, when you are selected for negotiation as a negotiation eligible drug, to your first initial offer, to your first CMS meeting, to a counteroffer, for dispute resolution, a meeting on the evidence and data that the manufacturer is able to bring to the table to inform those negotiations. So we see a very structured process with very little opportunity for a stalemate or an out, because there are requirements in place, or manufacturers face penalties for not actively participating in the process. In terms of the data and like the HTAs that can be used within that IRA negotiations in particular, they do include a range that are statutorily defined in terms of what is eligible for use. That includes things like the research and development costs, unit costs of production, distribution, market data in terms of revenue, sales volumes, the competitive landscape, but it also does include clinical value. So data on the cost effectiveness and the value of the drug compared to alternatives. And I think we're going to learn more, hopefully, from CMS next March, where they have committed to providing additional information on how this first cycle of negotiations went. Hopefully, they will be sharing at that time, how did the data around cost effectiveness and value factor into that process. It could definitely shape how manufacturers are thinking about their launch strategies, the importance of breakthrough status, the importance of getting pass-through payments or new technology add-on payment designations along their commercial journey, different milestones that can be used in the bigger argument of the product is a breakthrough, it has higher clinical value, and therefore impact its ultimate negotiation.
And the only thing I would add on top of what Fazia said is that that real world evidence and the data that you collect after is critical, right? But once you're in a commercial space, once you're in that non-preferred position, it's really difficult and challenging to get off, and will ultimately cost you more in the long run. So it's part of that strategic planning process that you have to go through the different scenarios of working through it. This happens, then what do you do here? But the data is key, and that real world evidence, not only the clinical benefits in the trial, but all of that real world evidence is factored into the guidelines that help set you up as well, and really becomes the standard of care, if you will.
And maybe I'll add. Oh, sorry, Mark. I'll just add one more piece before I forget it. We did talk about like the negotiation program and establishing what that price is, or the maximum fair price. But the big mystery that still exists is that while Part D plans have to cover the negotiated drugs, there is no clear parameters on how Part D plans need to cover the product. So to Kimberly's point, products that have had favorable positioning and access for patients at lower cost might actually shift tiers and could cost patients more out of pocket. And we know that CMS will put in guardrails to sort of monitor what happens. But from a patient and an advocacy perspective, I think there is substantial risk that patients might be paying more if we don't look at what happens in that 2026, formulary plan year.
Okay.
I just want to turn to, if I could, to sort of wrap up the pricing part, because I want to get to access, and I'm sensitive to time. But Nikos, if in Europe and Japan, is it fair to say that one price is one price? Because in the U.S., we have gross price and a net price, and even the government's claims of savings is based on gross price, when we know nobody pays that price. And in the media, you hear a lot about, oh, you could go to Canada or you could go other places, but we never really talk about net price versus global prices. Is it fair to say that there's one price for the drug in these countries?
No, there is no one price. There are many prices.
No, I realize that for multiple, but I mean inside one country. Let's say inside one country, is there multiple prices in those countries?
Yeah. So basically, as it was pointed out, in the discussion we had, in both continents, Europe, US, and then in Japan, we start from a price. That's the list price, the starting price. So in the States, it's free. Manufacturers can sell it for free. In Europe, it's not. There will be some sort of direct or indirect method to start setting the price. But then there will be many other price control, direct or indirect mechanisms to control the prices. First of all, there will be managerial agreements. So some of those agreements will be financially based. Some of them will be outcomes based. What's a financial based agreement? It means that the more volume and the more sales you have to give back to the government or the payer, higher discounts, higher rebates. So basically, that really defines at the end of the day your rise at the end. Also, in terms of the outcomes-based agreements, some of them are very sophisticated, and indirectly, they have an impact on your price. Then, many European systems we have mechanisms of clawbacks. So basically, in France, Italy, there is a scheme in the UK. So basically, the manufacturers, after they exceed a certain budget, they have to give the money back. So basically, you might have a really nice negotiation, and you might get the best possible price you were targeting at the beginning, but the budget might not be enough. And in that case, you have to give the money back. So that's an indirect way of reducing your prices. Also, in certain countries, the previous discussion made a lot of references into, are you a drug that you're first in the market, you're second in the market, you're third in the market? Many countries in Europe, they have dynamic pricing systems. So basically, automatically, where a second product gets into the market, that product is being priced with reference to the first in the market, but then the first in the market actually has to face a price cut. And so forth. As we have more and more products into a cluster, prices go down. Same happens, of course, when you lose patent protection, you have generics. And in certain countries, it's not like in the States. In the States, it's a free market, it's a competitive market. Competition will drive prices down. In Europe, even in the off-patent space, the prices are regulated. So basically, once you lose your protection, in many countries, you will lose immediately the same day half of your price. So this is just to justify that price is not one. There are many prices, and this really creates a very complex system for manufacturers really to operate.
And we often hear that the net prices here in the U.S. are much higher than they are in other developed nations like Europe. And is that because of this government price setting that you described, Nikos, or is there some other set of influences that trigger that?
This is a huge discussion. Huge.
Okay. Well,
We can discuss it from now until to our 30th session.
That would be in episode 24.
Yeah.
24, 25.
Okay.
But
Exactly.
it's true. It's true that the prices in the US are much higher. But then there are other factors. Pharmaceuticals, they are a public good. Pharmaceuticals protect human life, but at the same time, they have been manufactured by one of the most important industries, on the planet. And so basically, there is a commercial, there is an industrial aspect into it. The United States actually, the United States market is half of the world's market.
Right.
The United States accounts for half of the global spending in pharmaceuticals. The United States is the basis for some of the top manufacturers worldwide. A lot of the innovation comes there. We need to remember that the pharmaceutical business is a business that is reinvesting a lot. 20%, 25% goes back towards developing the drugs of the future. And there is quite often a free ride effect. Even if the rest of the country stop really paying for drugs, the states really will have to discover new drugs for their own populations, and then the others would have to benefit from that. So there is a huge discussion about affordability, about the value adding in the economy. But it's true to say that these arguments apply for us in Europe. And we have European healthcare systems which we actually use much less expensive products than in the States. Obviously, it's very difficult quite often to make the comparisons because many of the discounts and the rebates described earlier are secret. They're not really publicly available, so you don't really know what's the end user price for a product. But generally speaking, in Europe we have less expensive products.
Well, let's go then to the access side of it. Kim, maybe we start with you as well. In the U.S., what do you see as some of the major barriers to access? What do you see the patient, the patient's cost share? We'll get to. I want to contrast that with what we want to ask Nico on the same topic. So why don't you sort of set the stage in the U.S.?
Sure. So when you think about patient costs, manufacturers will offer support services, right? So they'll offer what we refer to as patient assistance programs to be able to help with that cost share. So the cost share could be anywhere up to 20% of the total cost of drug. So they'll offer a copay assistance program. They'll also offer what we refer to as free drug programs, or PAP. You'll hear that acronym a lot. Patient assistance programs. These costs can actually be very substantial and impact overall net sales price of the products. So there are many compliance programs and support programs that are required to administer these type of programs, but that's critical to that ultimate patient access and the patient care. So for commercially insured patients, most manufacturers will have a copay assistance program that will pay for most of the drug costs as far as their copay, if not all of the copay assistance. For government insured patients like Medicaid and TRICARE, those copays are very small and usually are not a typical barrier for that patient to be able to afford their drug. And typically copay assistance programs are not allowed, and it's not an option for a government insured program. But ultimately the PAP is if that patient can qualify and the patient cannot access the drug because they cannot afford it, they can qualify to receive that patient assistance program where it's free drug. In many cases, it can be free drug for up to the year period that they're on in their calendar year. And that's really where the Medicare patients are impacted.
Yeah, Fazia, do you mind offering some perspective on that? Because
Yep.
what's getting a lot of press during the presidential election is insulin, but help us understand some of the access, public policy side of this for
Sure.
the other drugs as well.
Sure, happy to. And the $35 insulin cap was mandated as part of the Inflation Reduction Act and just limits the patient cost sharing for Medicare beneficiaries to that limit. And a number of states have also adopted, state laws that also limit the patient out-of-pocket cost for drugs like insulin. So I do think from like an access component, that mandate will probably have to come from Congress in order to push through, through the various programs. But it does improve access. It does reduce patient out-of-pocket costs. But of course, we have to weigh that against increases in potential premiums and sort of the offset here in the U.S. because somebody else has to pick up that cost sharing. I might say we should spend more time as a country looking at health insurance design and actuarial analysis to see, does it really have to increase premiums? But I think that's kind of what we all believe theoretically happens as you increase benefits for patients or you reduce their out-of-pocket costs, that there is that give and take. I think from a policy perspective, another piece to highlight, building off of what Kim highlighted in terms of the manufacturer patient assistance programs, is plans who use accumulators or maximizers that essentially limit or exclude that support from counting towards a patient's out-of-pocket maximum. So in many ways, if you are getting support from a manufacturer and they are offsetting your out-of-pocket costs, by, let's say, $50 a month, that $50 a month support that the patient is getting from the manufacturer will not count towards their out-of-pocket maximum. So keeping them in, if they're in a high deductible health plan, in that high phase before hitting a deductible where their costs will go down. That, to me, I think is a huge challenge for patients because it discourages them from using programs that can really help their affordability. So they have to make the trade-off, right, in terms of, where they stay in their benefit versus lower cost directly at the pharmacy counter. So there are policy alternatives to address plans who are using these tools so that they don't discourage use of tools that can help access and adherence immediately at the counter.
Puts the burden right back on the patient.
That's right.
As well as the manufacturer, and protects the payers.
Yep, I agree.
Thank you. And if I could, just Nikos, sorry, Scott, I'm hogging
Yeah,
this one.
please, no.
But Nikos, are there support, like what are the support programs to support the patient access and in some of these European countries? And do you don't need things like free drug programs or patient assistance, right? Because everybody's covered, or help us understand what's in place for the patients.
Well, we have, publicly funded healthcare systems in Europe. However, first of all, there are lots of delays in the access because of these negotiations. Sometimes for the manufacturers, it takes years to negotiate with governments on the coverage. And, imagine, 2 or 3 years. During these negotiations, people don't have an access to innovative medicine. There's an opportunity cost there. So the complexity of regulation in the negotiations in Europe, they serve an efficiency purpose, but the cost quite often is in terms of access. Now, many of the countries, they have in parallel to the mainstream negotiation and access pathways, they have parallel systems for early access. But if you try to replace the normal pathway with some sort of back corridors, I mean, they will give partial access to some of the people, but not really to all the people. They are not going to serve the purpose, because the purpose is to have access through the main channels. So, for instance, you remember that there was an issue quite a few years in the UK about access of people to cancer patients. And at the end of the day, you have to create a new fund specifically for cancer patients. But what happens with diabetes patients? What happens with other types of patients? The answer is not really to create special funds. After 10 years, people complain about the access, and politicians start reacting on the dissatisfaction of the people. The question is how to have efficient but accessible care to people as well. So some of these mechanisms, in the same way, I'm quite confident that despite the best efforts of the industry or some of the programs in the States, obviously these are remedies, but they don't really solve the main access issue to people. And the other obviously important thing everywhere is copayments, especially for serious illnesses. Copayments, they have been really associated with catastrophic consequences for people in terms of their welfare. There is an important indication of the welfare of different countries in terms of how many people per year are being destroyed. They have to face a catastrophic healthcare event. And quite often the people that are in healthcare need, they are in economic need as well. So that's why it's important for us in the healthcare systems to have really good, fast access to the medications for the people need, in order really to reduce the inequalities and to improve the access of people. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about healthcare, we're talking about health. And most of the countries we are talking about, they are very affluent countries. I mean, they have the money to finance good health care for their people. And it's a responsibility of all of us to make sure that this will happen.
Thank you.
Yeah. And one final question for each of you. So despite all of these complex approaches that you've described, there remains, quite a bit of tension around drug pricing and access for patients as well. And I'd be keen to understand from your perspectives, what do you think future trends might hold in each of your domain? And Fazia, why don't we start with you from like a U.S. government perspective? What could happen in the future?
Wow, I feel like we're in such dynamic times that my crystal ball is extra murky these days. I almost feel like anything could happen. But I think what you're likely to see is sort of an onward march of existing trends. I do think we're going to be looking to see negotiation potentially expand the number of drugs, access to commercial markets. And I think you might see some tweaks around the fringes, depending upon election results, where maybe ideas such as, that foreign reference pricing or most favored nation status becomes a negotiation lever. I think, though, that we're likely to see the continued long march to value-based care and agreements. But I'm hopeful that we can see more innovation that factors in patient value. Because I do think that continues to be a key missing voice, is defining value in access and choices for patients. So I think that's going to be really important.
Thanks. And Kim, for the commercial markets generally, but in particular, what's the future of the PBM industry in the U.S.?
That's a whole nother chapter in itself. Yeah. So I think I'll talk broadly, if that's okay. I think that the upcoming election, you talked about that right at the very beginning. I think that's going to have a big play is into the outcome of what's going to happen. I think we're going to consider to see that drug price negotiation, and I think it's going to get more intense. But what's interesting is it's who's coming into the marketplace, right? So it's not just about the PBMs, but it's this big tech and healthcare. Companies like Amazon all of a sudden announcing that they're going to have a pharmacy. You've got Apple, Microsoft, increasing entrance into the healthcare space. And how is that going to change the dynamics, whether they're leveraging their technology and the data capabilities? And then the other piece that's very common and it's happening real time is the vertical integration. So how the specialty pharmacies, the payers, the PBMs, and the managed care and the hospitals and the providers are all merging together to have more leverage in that negotiation. Really, ultimately, are they still focused on the patient? That's really one thing that remains, at the most important part. That's what we're all focused on. Yeah. And then private equity is also coming into this space. So I see that a lot in the oncology world, of private equity coming in and buying up clinics and oncology clinics, and how are they going to invest? So it's the dynamic of who's going to be in the space and ultimately making sure we do not lose sight of that patient care.
Yeah, good. And Nikos, any predictions about how things may evolve in Europe?
Things will evolve in a very fascinating, very promising way for all of us. I mean, going back in the last 25 years, the amount of innovation, the new discoveries, the benefits that healthcare has seen as phenomenal, and that trend will accelerate, and the whole environment will completely change with new players coming into the space, new modes of delivery, and a lot of innovation, not only in pharmaceuticals, but outside pharmaceuticals. And that's why, the issue of affordability and access, if we go back in the last 25 years in the US and Europe, there's hardly any time that wasn't one of the top themes during the elections. So this really shows the importance of the topic. And I think that we'll see more sophisticated ways of trying to deliver affordable medicines to people. Some of the new innovations that will be coming out will be really expensive. In Europe, certainly, we will see more coordination of our efforts. In the same fashion we started many years ago being more coordinated in the way we approve pharmaceuticals. Now we are going to focus in the next few years to try to find more coordinated ways of evaluating value, even though that's really difficult and very, it has a different meaning to different audiences. But we certainly will tighten our efforts around, coordinating. And I think also a lot will be about value-based healthcare, about value-based outcomes, about evaluating the true value for patients in healthcare systems, and then directing the money, directing finance in those uses that maximize the value. And I want to say one final thing, which is a concern to me, and it should be a concern to many people. There is a lot of inefficiency in healthcare systems. A lot of this discussion would be easier. We could fund all this innovation that is coming out, giving people a lot of a better access to healthcare. We were able to eliminate a lot of the inefficiency around, and this is something that should be in our agenda.
Yeah, very good.
Well, no doubt. And let me just say thank you. Thank you to Nikos and Kimberly and Fazia. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. If it's okay, Scott, I think your question sort of summarized. I don't think we need to ask our usual end of the episode question on what is your prescription for better access, because I think we just heard some three really great perspectives on where things could go. So with that, why don't you want to offer some of your perspectives before we end the episode?
Well, sure. I'm struck by the importance of this topic in both the U.S. as well as obviously the other developed nations. Importance of preserving both affordability and access for medicines. I'm also struck, though, by the tension that is inherent upon that, between supporting innovation and managing budgets. And
right.
it occurs in Europe, obviously, and it occurs, in the U.S. And so it's important. There's tension in it. And but the systems strike me as having some foundationally, very different approaches, and that are kind of based in, the beliefs and expectations of the respective societies. That there's as Nikos pointed out, the providers, it's a much more nationalized community, common base in the European nations. Even the provider systems are, managed by the government and often so on. And they take sort of this community approach then to making the decisions about what the drug price is going to be and how everyone then will be able to access it or not. And whereas here in the U.S., we don't have quite as strong an orientation around that. We have a private sector that does most of the provider side of healthcare, but also, the medication, the drug companies as well. And so within that context, we leave it up to those actors to sort out, what the price is going to be, and then what the access is going to be for the patients behind that. And I'm not sure, it's hard to tell. Like, it's probably what fits best for your society, and right. As opposed to necessarily one's better than another. But it's been an interesting compare and contrast as I've listened and reflected on what our guests have shared.
I think I would just add that I totally agree with you, and I've been fortunate to have traveled to Japan and just been in Europe twice this year, and those you're right, the communities are different. They queue up to stand in lines, right, to get onto the bus.
Yeah.
I mean, they're the U.S. They'll just go right on up, and I think when it comes to healthcare, they're comfortable. Nikos mentioned that there's long waits. That's a consideration.
Yeah.
In this country, that would be outrageous. You'd have people going to the front page of the newspaper to put somebody, to vilify somebody if they're limiting their access to a drug that would save somebody's life, right? So I think you're right. The community aspect of it is different, but I also think the incentives that we have in this country, like Nikos mentioned, the innovation is happening here. There's a bit of this, just like we do for global transport. The U.S. Navy supports the U.S. supports the global transport in this world, and in this industry, in the pharmaceutical industry, we're now the driver of innovation that a lot of the rest of the world is coming along. And so, I think that's. Do we pay higher prices? Yes. Is it worth it to be the first in line? Is it worth it to be the first to have access to these patients? Potentially. But I think like you said, the tension here is too great. I mean, there's so much here, which leads me to my last point. I can see why Joe and Comey said they thought we're going to need 3 episodes.
Yeah.
So, because this is now our longest episode we've ever recorded, and we haven't even begun to tackle some of these
Scratch
things.
the surface.
Yeah. So with that, let me say thank you to Nikos and Kim and Fazia for taking the time to join us. I hope this has been a great experience for all of you as well.
It's been great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
It's been
all.
wonderful. Thank you.
And with that, thank you to my co-host, Dr. Scott Howe, and thank you to everybody for listening. We're very, very proud to actually have achieved over 1,000 downloads a month for several months in a row. So we're really proud of the growth of the podcast, and that's thanks to all the listeners. And so we will have show notes about today's episode, including more not only ways to access all of our guests, but also more information about the Access Forum and what we have ahead in 2025. With that, let's wrap up episode 23. Thank you, Scott.
Thanks, Mark. Thanks, everyone.